The morning Helen Shelton set her last dozen jars of clover honey on the market table, she had exactly $4.32 to her name, a beehive operation that had survived 2 harsh winters, and absolutely no patience left for the kind of man who would change all of that before the sun reached its noon peak. Millhaven, Texas, 1882, was not a town that asked much of its women and gave even less in return. It sat square in the middle of a flat, sun-scorched stretch of hill country, where the cedar and live oak grew stubborn and low to the ground, as if they too had long ago made peace with hardship. The main street ran roughly half a mile from the grain mill at its northern end to the livery stable at its southern, and everything a person needed, or most of what they needed, could be found somewhere along that dusty corridor. There was a general store run by the Pemberton family, a land office that smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and broken promises, a church whose congregation was devoted but small, and on the first Saturday of every month, a market that drew farmers, ranchers, and the occasional drifter from as far as 30 miles in every direction. Helen had been coming to this market since she was a girl of 12, standing at her mother's elbow and learning which customers preferred to be spoken to warmly and which preferred silence. Her mother, Ruth Shelton, had kept bees on their small farm just east of town for most of her adult life, and when she passed 3 years ago in the autumn of 1879, she left Helen the farm, the hives, the knowledge, and a handwritten book of recipes and remedies that used honey in ways most people never considered. Helen had been 22 then, alone in the truest sense of the word, with a brother who had headed west to California 4 years prior and never written back after the second letter. She had kept the farm. She had kept the bees. She had learned to repair fences herself, to pull water from the well before dawn, to sleep through the sounds that the Texas night made when it was trying to frighten a person. And she had brought her honey to the market every first Saturday, arranged the jars just the way her mother taught her amber glass, catching the light, handwritten labels in her own careful script, each jar sealed with wax and tied at the neck with a strip of calico fabric. The market on this particular October morning was busy in the way that autumn markets in Texas always were. The air held a coolness that would be gone by midday, and people moved through the stalls with a kind of energy that the summer heat had stolen from them for months. There were bushels of late-season squash, bolts of gingham cloth, fresh ground cornmeal, saddle leather, dried herbs tied in bunches, and jars of preserves in colors ranging from deep plum to bright gold. Helen's table was near the center of the row, which was good for traffic, and she had arrived early enough to claim it. By 9 in the morning she had sold 4 jars. By 10 she had sold 3 more. She was doing well, better than last month, and she allowed herself a small private satisfaction as she counted the coins in the tin box she kept beneath the table. At this rate she would cover the cost of new wax and the repairs the south fence needed before the first hard freeze. She would not be comfortable, but she would be steady, and steady was what Helen Shelton had built her entire life around. She was wrapping a jar in a square of brown paper for old Mrs. Yarborough when she first noticed him. He was standing at the far edge of the market, just beyond the last table, and he was looking at her. Not in the way that men sometimes looked at a woman at the market, the quick, assessing glance that was over before it began. He was looking the way a person looks when they have already made some kind of decision and are simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of build that came from years of physical work and not from any particular vanity about it. He wore a dark coat that was clean but well-traveled, and a hat with a wide brim that he had pushed back slightly, as if he wanted an unobstructed view of whatever he was looking at. He was looking at her table, at her honey. Helen finished wrapping Mrs. Yarborough's jar, accepted her coins with a smile, and turned back to straighten her remaining stock. When she looked up again, the man was walking toward her with a steady, unhurried pace that seemed out of place in the busy noise of the market. He stopped at the edge of her table and looked at the row of jars with what appeared to be genuine consideration. "Clover honey?" he asked. "Clover and wildflower," Helen said. "The clover comes out lighter. The wildflower has more depth to it. Depends what you want to use it for." He picked up a jar of wildflower and held it to the light. The amber column of it glowed warm gold in the October sun. "I'll take them," he said. Helen waited a moment. "Which kind did you want?" "All of them," he said. He set the jar down and looked at her directly for the first time, and she saw that his eyes were a dark, serious brown, the kind that seemed to take in more than they gave back. "How many do you have?" Helen counted without looking. She had 11 jars remaining on the table. 11, she said slowly. "I'll take all 11, he said, and he reached into his coat and produced a coin purse with a matter-of-fact calm that suggested this was a perfectly ordinary thing to be doing on a Saturday morning. Helen stared at him. In 3 years of selling honey at this market, she had never sold more than 7 jars in a single morning, and those 7 had been sold to 6 different people over the course of 3 hours. "That is $2.75, she said carefully. "That's fine," he said. She did not move immediately. She was too busy trying to understand what was happening. A man did not walk up to a market table and buy 11 jars of honey without some particular reason for it. She was a practical woman and she did not romanticize things, and so her first thought was that he was buying for a business, a hotel, perhaps, or a restaurant. Her second thought was that he had mistaken her honey for something else. Her third thought, which arrived quietly and without invitation, was that there was something peculiar and deliberate about the way he was watching her. She began wrapping the jars in brown paper and nestling them carefully into the wooden crate she kept beneath the table for exactly this kind of bulk purchase, though in truth she had never needed it for a single customer before. "Are you new to Millhaven?" she asked, because she knew everyone in this town and she did not know him. "Arrived Thursday," he said. He was watching her wrap the jars with a kind of focused attention that she found both unnerving and oddly sincere. "Passing through?" she asked. "No," he said. "I bought the Callaway place." Helen's hands paused for just a moment over the crate. The Callaway place was 500 acres of good land about 2 miles north of her own farm, with a creek that ran reliable most of the year and a house that needed work but had good bones. Old Gus Callaway had sold it and moved to live near his daughter in San Antonio after his wife passed last spring. Half the county had been wondering who would buy it. "That is a good piece of land," she said, resuming her work. "I know it is," he said. "That's why I bought it." He paid her the $2.75 exactly, without asking for any discount despite the volume of his purchase, and he lifted the crate with one hand in a way that suggested it was no particular effort. "Isaac McCrae," he said, and he held out his free hand to shake. "Helen Shelton," she said, and she shook it, and his grip was firm and brief and honest. He picked up his crate and walked away through the crowd, and Helen stood at her empty table and looked at the coins in her tin box and thought that was the strangest and most efficient transaction she had ever conducted in her life. She did not think about him again that day. Or rather, she tried not to, which was a different thing entirely. The following week she went about the ordinary business of her farm. She checked the hives, repaired the fence as planned, put up the last of her late-season vegetables, and spent 2 evenings by lamplight going through the account book she kept for the farm's finances. The sale at the market had given her more breathing room than she'd had in months, and she felt a quiet, careful optimism that she did not want to disturb by examining it too closely. On Wednesday she rode into Millhaven to pick up a package at the general store beeswax sheets she had ordered from a supplier in San Antonio, and while she was there, Elmer Pemberton, who ran the store and knew everything about everyone in a 30-mile radius, mentioned almost as an aside that the new owner of the Callaway place had come in Tuesday and bought a large quantity of provisions. "He seems like a solid sort of man," Elmer said approvingly. "Paid cash for everything." asked sensible questions, didn't try to bargain down the price. "Is that so?" Helen said. "Name's McCrae," Elmer said, watching her with the mild, curious eyes of a man who had been watching people make decisions for 40 years. "Isaac McCrae. Came down from up near Abilene, I believe. Had cattle up there. Lost the herd in a drought 2 years back, apparently. Took him a while to get back on his feet." Helen thought about this. She thought about a man starting over after losing everything, choosing a new piece of land, paying cash for everything, and arriving at a market on his first Saturday in town, and buying every jar of honey on a stranger's table. She picked up her beeswax and rode home and did not mention Isaac McCrae to anyone, because there was no one to mention him to, and because she was not yet sure what there was to say. The next market morning was 4 weeks away. She was not counting. She absolutely was counting. October gave way to November, and with it came the particular clarity that the Texas hill country gets in the autumn, when the air is thin and bright and everything seems sharper than it did in the heavy summer. Helen spent her mornings with the bees. There was less work to do as the season wound down, but she checked on them faithfully, making sure their stores were sufficient for winter, wrapping the more vulnerable hives against the north wind that would eventually come screaming down from the panhandle. In the afternoons, she worked on the honey harvest she had been processing since September, filling jar after jar on the long wooden table in her kitchen, labeling them in her careful hand. She had been living alone on this farm for 3 years, and she had made a kind of peace with the solitude. She ate her meals at a table set for one. She read in the evenings by the light of an oil lamp, working her way through the small collection of books her mother had kept on the shelf above the fireplace. She talked to the bees, which her mother had always done, and which Helen had initially felt foolish doing but had eventually come to find genuinely soothing. She was not unhappy. She was not, if she was honest with herself, entirely content either, but she had long ago decided that the gap between those two states was simply what life was, and she filled it with work and with purpose, and with the particular satisfaction of watching something she tended grow and produce and sustain. She did not need a man to complete the picture. She was not the sort of woman who thought in those terms. She was not, however, the sort of woman who could entirely stop herself from wondering about Isaac McCrae and his 11 jars of honey and his solid, unhurried way of moving through the world. She found out more about him in the way that everyone in a small town finds out things, not through any deliberate inquiry, but through the slow, inevitable accumulation of other people's conversations. She learned from the pastor's wife that Isaac McCrae had attended Sunday service and sat in the back row and shook hands politely, but not effusively. She learned from the blacksmith that he had brought in a draft horse for new shoes and had asked technically informed questions about the quality of the iron. She learned from Mary Holt, who ran the boarding house, that he had stayed there his first 2 nights in town before moving out to the Callaway place, and that he had been the quietest boarder she could remember up before dawn, back after dark, not given to making noise or demands. She had still not seen him again herself, and she was beginning to wonder if the market transaction had meant nothing to him at all, a practical man making a practical purchase, nothing more. She was beginning to tell herself that was fine, that she had simply invented a significance that wasn't there, and that invented significance was something a practical woman ought to be able to dismiss. Then November's first Saturday arrived. Helen arrived at the market with 14 jars of honey, 6 clover, 5 wildflower, and 3 of a late-season dark amber variety she had been producing more of recently, which her mother had called buckwheat honey, though Helen had never been entirely sure that was the right name for it. She set up her table, arranged the jars in the morning light, and told herself she was not looking for anyone in particular. He arrived at 9:30. He walked through the market the same way he had the first time, steady, purposeful, not hurrying but not dawdling either, and he came directly to her table as if he had already known exactly where he was going. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and she was proud of how level her voice was. He looked at her table. He looked at the 14 jars. Then he looked at her with those dark, serious eyes and said, "I'll take all of them." Helen put her hands flat on the table and looked at him. "Mr. McCrae," she said. "That's me," he said. "Do you actually like honey?" There was a pause. "A real one, the kind that comes not from hesitation, but from a man deciding exactly how honest he intends to be." "That is not the point," he said. Helen stared at him. The market moved and hummed around them, children running past, a horse snorting somewhere nearby, two women arguing pleasantly over the price of cornmeal, and Helen Shelton, who was a practical woman who did not romanticize things, felt something shift in her chest like a door opening in a house she had thought was closed. "That is not the point," she repeated slowly. "No," he said, "it is not." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, patient and direct, and she had the peculiar sensation of being seen very clearly by someone who had no reason to look so carefully. "Then what is the point?" she asked. "I have not yet decided how to answer that in a way that does not make me sound like a fool," he said, with a seriousness that was somehow also the most honest thing she had ever heard a man say to her. Helen felt the corner of her mouth turn upward. She tried to stop it and was only partially successful. "$3.50, she said. "For all 14. "That's fair," he said, and he paid her and lifted the crate she had already begun loading and looked at her once more before he left. "Good morning, Miss Shelton," he said. "Good morning, Mr. McCrae," she said. She watched him disappear into the crowd, and then she turned around and stood very still for a moment and thought that she was in a great deal of trouble. The trouble, as it turned out, was the enjoyable kind. He came back the following Saturday, though the market only ran once a month. He did not have a purchase in mind. He simply arrived at her table at 9 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee from the tent that the Garza family ran at the east end of the market, and asked if she would mind company. "I do not usually get company," she said, because it was true, and it seemed like the right thing to say. "I noticed," he said, "people come to buy and then they leave. Nobody stops." "It is a market," she said. "People are busy." "You are also busy," he said, "but I thought you might not mind a brief interruption." He handed her the coffee. She took it. The cup was warm in her hands and the coffee was strong and good, and they stood on either side of her table in the November morning and talked. He did not make small talk the way most people did: the weather, the price of grain, the news from San Antonio. He asked her questions. About the bees. About how long she had been keeping them. About what she found most difficult. About whether there was a particular season she preferred. He listened to her answers with a complete attention that she found almost startling, because in her experience men either asked questions they didn't want answers to or they didn't ask at all. She asked him questions in return. About the Callaway place, about what he planned to do with it. He told her he was going to run cattle again, smaller operation than before, build it slowly and right this time. He had learned, he said, that going big before you had the ground under you was how you ended up with nothing. "How old are you?" she asked, because she had been wondering. 28, he said. "You?" 25, she said. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. They talked for an hour before the first customer came to her table, and he stepped aside and let her work. And then when the customer left, he stepped back. This happened 4 times over the course of the morning, and each time he simply waited, quietly, without impatience, as if waiting for Helen Shelton to have a free moment was something he had already decided was worth his time. When the market wound down and she began packing her remaining jars, she had sold 8 today, which was a good morning. He helped her carry the crates to her wagon without being asked. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know I do not," he said, and he set the crate in the wagon bed with the same efficient economy of motion that seemed to characterize everything he did. She drove home thinking about the way he had listened to her talk about the bees. Most people's eyes glazed over within 2 sentences on the subject of hive management. He had asked a follow-up question about the relationship between the queen and the worker bees that had actually required her to think before answering. Over the weeks that followed, a pattern emerged that neither of them explicitly negotiated, but that somehow became the expected shape of things. He came to the market on the first Saturday of each month and bought all her remaining honey and stayed to talk. When she was at the general store, she sometimes saw him there, and they would speak for a few minutes with the easy familiarity of people who have decided to be friendly with each other even before they have quite decided to be anything more. One afternoon in late November, she was riding the fence line on the north edge of her property, and she saw him doing the same on his side of the boundary between their farms, and they stopped on either side of the cedar post fence and talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular: the state of the grass, the likelihood of rain, the deer she had been seeing at the east tree line, and when she rode home, she realized her face hurt from smiling. December came in cold and dry, with a sharp north wind that stripped the last leaves off the cottonwoods along the creek. Helen finished her winter preparations, banked the most exposed hives, laid in her supplies, and settled into the slower pace that winter demanded. She had more time for reading, more time for the handwork she let slide in the busy seasons: mending, weaving, the careful work of maintaining things. She was also, she admitted to herself one evening while the fire popped and the wind tested the windows, thinking about Isaac McCrae with a frequency and a depth that had moved well beyond the casual. She thought about the way he had said that was not the point with such plain, unadorned conviction. She thought about the way he listened. She thought about the way he had helped load her wagon without being asked and without making anything of it. She thought about the fact that in all their conversations he had never once said anything that was not true, at least as far as she could verify, and that this seemed to her an extraordinary quality in a person. She was not naive. She knew that a man could be careful with the truth while he was courting and less careful after, and she knew that her own lonely circumstances made her vulnerable to seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was actually there. She held her feelings at arm's length and examined them with the same calm practicality she applied to her account book. She was not going to fall headlong into anything. She was nonetheless falling. The Sunday before Christmas, Helen went to church as she always did, and afterward, standing in the cold churchyard with her coat pulled close, she found herself standing next to Isaac McCrae, who had apparently also attended, as he apparently had every Sunday since he arrived in Millhaven, though she had been sitting far enough forward that she had not seen him. "Merry Christmas, Miss Shelton," he said. "Merry Christmas, Mr. McCrae," she said. "Are you going back to the farm?" "I am," he said. "You?" "Yes," she said. There was a pause, and then she said with a boldness that surprised her, "Would you like to have supper at my farm on Christmas evening? I always cook more than I can eat, and it seems a wasteful thing." He looked at her. Something moved behind those serious brown eyes, a warmth she was only beginning to know how to read. "I would like that very much," he said. She cooked a roasted chicken and cornbread and a pot of beans, and opened one of her jars of wildflower honey to serve alongside the bread. And she set the table for two and lit the good candles, and told herself she was not making anything of this that it was not. He arrived at 5:30 with a bottle of decent bourbon he had apparently acquired from somewhere and a practical gift that made her laugh when she unwrapped it: a new pair of leather-work gloves, the kind specifically suited to beekeeping, with reinforced fingers and a long cuff. "Where did you find beekeeping gloves in Millhaven?" she demanded. "I wrote to a supplier in Austin," he said. She stared at him. "You wrote to a supplier in Austin for beekeeping gloves?" "The ones you were wearing at the market last month had a hole in the right thumb," he said. "I noticed." Helen stood in her kitchen with the gloves in her hands and looked at Isaac McCrae, who was standing in her doorway with a bourbon bottle and a completely matter-of-fact expression, and she thought that she had never in her life been paid such careful, practical attention by anyone. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was softer than she intended. "You're welcome," he said, equally soft. They ate supper at her small kitchen table, and the bourbon was opened and poured into the 2 good glasses she kept for occasions, and they talked for 3 hours after the meal was finished, about his years in Abilene, about the drought that had taken his cattle, and the 2 years of slow, grinding recovery that had followed, about the decision to come south and start again. He told her about his father, who had died when Isaac was 19, and left him the Abilene operation too young and with too little experience, and about the pride that had kept him from asking for help until there was nothing left to help with. He told her these things plainly, without self-pity, and without the false bravado she might have expected, and she listened the way he always listened to her, completely. She told him about her mother, about the years of learning the bees and the land, and then the sudden, stunning reality of managing it all alone at 22. She told him about the brother who never wrote back, and the way that silence sat in her like a stone she had eventually learned to carry without letting it slow her down. She told him she had been afraid those first 2 winters, and that she had never told anyone else that because in this county fear in a woman was taken as an invitation to make decisions on her behalf. "That would not happen with me," he said quietly. "I know," she said, and she meant it, and the fact that she meant it surprised her with its certainty. He left at 9 o'clock, stepping out into the cold Christmas night, and he shook her hand at the door the way he always did, but this time he held it a moment longer than usual and she did not pull away. "Helen," he said. "Isaac," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both knew it. He smiled, finally, a real smile, the kind that reached all the way to those dark eyes, and it remade his face entirely, and she thought she had never seen anything so worth waiting for in her life. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. January arrived with all the particular hardship that a Texas winter could deliver, not the heavy snows of the north, but a sustained, penetrating cold and wind that kept everyone close to their fires and made the ordinary work of farming a small daily trial of endurance. Helen got up before dawn every morning, dressed in her warmest layers, and made her rounds of the farm before the sun was fully up. The bees were quiet, conserving their heat, and she checked on them with the soft, unhurried attention she gave everything she cared for. Isaac had begun coming by the farm on Wednesday afternoons, a habit that had established itself in December and continued into the new year with the naturalness of something that had always been. He came on horseback, his big bay gelding moving along the familiar road between their properties with an ease that suggested the horse had also decided this was a normal route. He helped with whatever needed doing: fence repairs, the moving of heavy stores, the clearing of fallen cedar that winter storms sent across the paths. He was a good worker and a better companion, and Helen had stopped pretending, at least to herself, that she didn't look forward to Wednesdays with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the labor. One Wednesday afternoon in late January, they were working together to clear a section of fence line that a large cedar had fallen across the previous night, and the work was cold and difficult and required the kind of coordinated effort that made it nearly wordless, each of them reading what the other needed without having to say it. When the cedar was finally moved and the fence posts checked and resecured, they stood back and looked at their work with the shared satisfaction of 2 people who have done something hard together. "You are good at this," he said. "You say that every time," she said. "Because it is true every time," he said. She looked at him. His coat was dusted with cedar bark, his breath making clouds in the cold air, and he was looking at her with that steady warmth that she had been carrying around in her chest like a small, persistent fire for 2 months now. "Isaac," she said. "Helen," he said, "are you planning to say something to me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then I am trying to find the right time." "The right time is usually just the present one," she said, "in my experience." He looked at her for a long, still moment, and then he said, "I came to this town because I was looking for a piece of land to start over on. I did not come here looking for anything else. And then I saw you at that market with your honey and your careful handwriting on those labels, and the way you counted my coins back to me like you expected me to make an argument about the price, and you were ready for it if I did, and I thought." He stopped. He looked down at the cleared fence line for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "I thought that was a woman worth knowing." Helen's heart was doing something complicated and undignified in her chest. "And have you found that to be the case?" she asked, and her voice was almost entirely steady. "Yes," he said. "In every way I have looked at it, yes." She stepped forward and took his hand, which was cold from the work, and she held it in both of hers. It was the boldest thing she had done, and she did not regret it for a single second. "I think," she said, "that you are also worth knowing. In every way I have looked at it." He turned his hand so that he was holding hers instead of the other way around, and he held it firmly and without any uncertainty, and they stood there in the cold January afternoon among the cedar and the winter grass. And it was not a dramatic thing, but it was a true one, and true things are always worth more. February brought the first real warmth, tentative and intermittent but present, and with it the first stirrings of spring work. Helen began her preparations for the coming season, cleaning and repairing her hive equipment, planning the placement of her new hives, assessing the winter losses among her existing colonies. She had lost 2 hives to the cold, which was not as bad as it could have been, and the remaining hives were strong and would build quickly once the first spring flowers began. Isaac had begun restocking his land with cattle, a modest beginning, 30 head from a rancher near Fredericksburg, delivered on a cold February morning in a trailing cloud of dust and complaint. Helen rode over to watch the arrival because he had mentioned it in passing, and she found she wanted to see it. She sat on the fence with her coat buttoned and her hat pulled against the wind and watched him work with the animals, and with the 2 ranch hands he had hired a young man named Pedro Vasquez, who was quick and capable and 20 years old, and an older man named Walt Drummond, who had been working cattle in this part of Texas for longer than most people in the county had been alive. Isaac moved through the work with the authority of someone who knew what he was doing and had earned the right to it through failure as much as success, and she watched him give clear instructions and accept experienced input from Walt without ego, and she thought she was watching someone who had genuinely learned something from the hard years. That was rarer than it sounded. Afterward, when the cattle were settled and the hands had gone to their supper, he came and stood beside her at the fence, and they looked at his small, new herd together. "They are a good start," she said. "They are," he agreed. 30 head. Give it 4 years and I will have 200. "You sound very certain," she said. "I have done the calculations," he said, "and I have better land this time," she smiled. "You have a better approach this time, I think, is what you mean." He looked at her sideways. "That too," he said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Helen, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer." Her pulse moved. "All right," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with your permission. Not just Wednesdays and market Saturdays. I mean," he paused, choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything. "I mean that I intend to marry you, if you will have me eventually, and I think we both know that already, and I would rather be honest about what I am working toward than pretend I am not working toward it." Helen looked at the cattle in the field. She thought about what it meant to agree to be courted by a man who had told her plainly, at the outset, that his intention was marriage. She thought about what it would mean to say no, and found that she could not actually construct a genuine reason for it. "I think," she said, "that any woman would be fortunate to be courted by a man who announces his intentions that clearly. It saves considerable confusion." "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is a yes," she said. He smiled. She had come to cherish that smile because it was never given for nothing, and it always meant exactly what it said. Spring came in properly in March, and with it the riot of wildflowers that made the hill country one of the most beautiful places Helen had ever seen, though she had nothing much to compare it to, having rarely left it. The fields around her farm turned into sweeping waves of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and primrose, and the bees woke up fully and threw themselves into the abundance with a focused, collective joy that she found moving in ways she never quite found words for. She was out in the fields with them in the mornings, managing the hive expansion she had been planning all winter, and the work was absorbing and good, and it felt, this spring, infused with a lightness that she could only attribute to the fact that there was now someone in her life who knew about all of it and cared. Isaac came every Wednesday and also on Sunday afternoons now, and they had fallen into the easy, companionable rhythm of two people who have decided to genuinely know each other. He told her about his plans for the cattle operation in detail, spreading hand-drawn maps on her kitchen table and explaining the rotation of grazing he intended, the water management, the timeline. She told him about the new hive varieties she was experimenting with, about the batch of honey she was trying to produce specifically from the bluebonnets, which she had read about in a letter from a beekeeper in Louisiana and had been wanting to attempt for 2 years. "Let me help with the bluebonnet experiment," he said one afternoon. "You do not know anything about beekeeping," she said, amused. "I know about bluebonnets," he said seriously. "I know which fields on my land have the largest stands. You could put hives on my property during the bloom." Helen looked at him. This was, in purely practical terms, a meaningful offer. The stands of bluebonnets on the old Callaway land were genuinely large. She had admired them from a distance for years. "That is actually very helpful," she said. "I know it is," he said. "That is why I offered it." They moved 6 hives to his property on a warm March evening, working together in the long Texas dusk, and the operation went smoothly because they had developed by now the kind of physical ease with each other that allowed for wordless coordination, each anticipating the other's movements without needing to explain them. April was the deepest spring, the weeks when everything the hill country had was fully deployed sun and wildflowers and warm nights, and the particular sweetness of new grass under horse hooves. Helen went to the April market with 18 jars of early honey, the most she had ever brought, and she set up her table in the golden morning and waited. He arrived at 9, as he always did, but this time he brought her coffee again, the way he had in November, and he leaned against the corner of her table, and they talked while customers came and went. She sold well 10 jars by midday, and he bought the remaining 8 with the same straightforward efficiency he always had. "You are still doing this," she said, watching him count out the money. "I intend to keep doing this," he said. "Even when we are married?" she asked, and she felt the slight color rise in her face because it was the first time she had said it that plainly. He looked at her with that warmth, full and serious and unhurried. "Especially then," he said. "Although at that point it will be half my money you are accepting, which simplifies the accounting." She laughed, openly and without restraint, and the sound surprised her a little because it came from somewhere unguarded, and she thought this was what it felt like to be truly comfortable with another person, when your own laughter surprised you. May arrived, and with it, a development that complicated the comfortable happiness of their spring. Helen received a letter from her brother, Thomas, the first letter in 4 years, written from Sacramento, California, where he had apparently been for 2 years after a period of rather chaotic westward drifting. The letter was brief and not notably apologetic, and it announced that Thomas was coming home, not to stay, he was careful to say, but to see how she was getting on and to deal with a matter involving the farm that he wanted to discuss. Helen read the letter 3 times at her kitchen table before she set it down. Then she sat very still for a long time. She told Isaac that evening. He listened without interrupting, and when she was finished he said, "What matter involving the farm?" "I don't know," she said. "Our mother's will was simple. She left the farm to both of us equally. He signed a document when I took it over agreeing that I would manage it and any proceeds would be mine. I have managed it for 3 years and put my own labor and money into it, and it is in considerably better condition than when she left it to us." "Do you have that document?" Isaac said. "Yes," she said. Make sure it is somewhere you can find it quickly, he said, quietly but with a firmness that she found deeply reassuring. Thomas Shelton arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday morning in late May, stepping off the stagecoach with a carpet bag and an air of genial confidence that Helen had always found simultaneously charming and infuriating. He was 29 years old and looked it, with their mother's blue eyes and a sunburn from the California sun, and he hugged Helen on the street outside the stage office with genuine warmth that she could not help but return, because despite everything she had missed him. He stayed at the boarding house because there was genuinely not space for him at the farm, or so Helen told him, which was partially true. He came to the farm for supper that first evening and ate appreciatively and looked around at everything she had built and said, "Helen, this is just wonderful. You have really done something here." "Yes," she said, "I have." She introduced him to Isaac the following afternoon when Isaac came for his Wednesday visit. Thomas shook his hand with the fluid sociability of a man who had spent years figuring out how to make quick impressions, and he smiled and was agreeable and said all the right things, and when Isaac left he turned to Helen and said, "He seems like a serious man." "He is," she said. "Are you planning to marry him?" "I am considering it," she said carefully. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The thing about the farm, Helen, I've been thinking that maybe we ought to revisit that arrangement. I have some debts, and the farm does represent half my inheritance, and—" "No," said Helen. He blinked. "You haven't heard what I was going to propose." "Thomas," she said, "I have the document you signed. I have 3 years of receipts and improvements and tax payments and labor invested in this farm. I have letters from Elmer Pemberton and the land office and the church that will confirm I have been the sole manager and resident of this property for 3 years. If you want to have a legal argument about my right to this farm, you may have it, but I promise you it will be a short and unsuccessful one." Her brother looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, the genial confidence dropping slightly to reveal something more genuine underneath. "You have grown up," he said. "I was already grown up when you left," she said. "I just had less evidence of it then." She did not tell him to leave. She was not that kind of person. But she made the situation clear, and Thomas, who was charming rather than cruel and who underneath the years of wandering was not a bad man, heard her clearly. He stayed another week, during which he and Helen had several more conversations that were more honest than any they had managed in childhood, and before he left, he signed an addendum to the original document, drafted by the land office at Helen's request, that confirmed the transfer of his share of the farm to Helen outright in exchange for a one-time payment she made him from her savings. It cost her nearly everything she had in the bank. She did not regret it for a moment. When she told Isaac what she had done, he looked at her for a long moment and then said, "That was the right thing to do." "I know it was," she said. "It also leaves you without a financial cushion," he said carefully. "I have an excellent honey harvest coming," she said, "and I have never needed a cushion that thick." He nodded slowly. "When I said I intend to marry you," he said, "I want you to know that I understand the farm is yours. Everything your mother built and everything you have built on it. That does not become mine when we marry. That is yours." Helen looked at him. In 1882 in Texas, what he was saying was not legally how things worked. A married woman's property generally became her husband's, and they both knew it. "In the eyes of the law," she began. "In the eyes of the law I will have control of it," he said, "and in practice it will be exactly as yours as it is today. I will put that in writing if you want it." She wanted it. She asked him to, and he did, without argument or drama, and she kept that document with the other one, and the keeping of it felt like the foundation of something very solid. The June market arrived on a Saturday that was already hot by 8 in the morning, the summer heat returning with its usual lack of apology. Helen brought 22 jars of her spring honey clover, wildflower, and the bluebonnet variety she had been working toward all season, pale gold and delicately sweet in a way that was distinct from anything she had produced before. She was proud of it, more than she usually let herself be proud of things. The bluebonnet honey sold out by 10 o'clock. All 6 jars, to 6 different people, all of them stopping to exclaim over the label and the color, and then the taste when she offered a small sample on a wooden spoon. By the time the market reached its midday conclusion, she had sold every jar she brought, for the first time in 3 years of doing this, and she was standing at an empty table with a full cash box and a feeling of genuine triumph. Isaac arrived at noon when the market was winding down because he had been occupied with a cattle issue in the morning. He looked at her empty table and at her face. "You sold everything," he said. "Every single jar," she said. He took the 2 steps between them and kissed her, right there in the middle of the market, in front of Elmer Pemberton and Mrs. Yarborough and Pastor Davis and half the county. A firm and decided and thoroughly public kiss that lasted exactly long enough to be unmistakable. When he stepped back, she was looking at him with wide eyes and flushed cheeks, and an expression that was somewhere between scandalized and delighted. "You have now done something very definitive," she said. "I know it," he said, entirely unruffled. "People will talk," she said. "Let them talk," he said. She laughed. She was going to let him get away with it because she did not actually want to argue with him about it, and because the truth was she had been waiting for precisely that for 6 months, and she thought it was worth the gossip, which would be pleasant gossip anyway. He asked her to marry him properly that evening, in the kitchen of her farmhouse, not with any theatrical ceremony, but with the same plain, direct honesty that characterized everything about him. He said he loved her, which he had never said before, and the saying of it was as deliberate and considered and certain as everything else he said, and she believed it completely. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while now." I was trying to be sensible about it. "How did that work out?" he asked. "Poorly," she said, "but enjoyably." They were married in September of 1882 in the Millhaven church on a Saturday morning, with the pastor's careful words and the warm attendance of most of the town. Helen wore her mother's dress, which she had altered to fit, and which was the color of fresh cream, and she carried a small bundle of late wildflowers that Isaac had gotten up before dawn to pick from the fields that still held them. He stood at the front of the church in a clean dark suit that she had helped him find, and he looked like himself entirely, serious and present and real. And when she walked down the short aisle toward him, he watched her the whole way with those dark, steady eyes, and something in them that she had learned by now to recognize as a form of happiness so deep it did not need to announce itself. The ceremony was brief, as ceremonies in that time and place tended to be, and the celebration afterward was held in the churchyard, with tables of food brought by half the congregation and fiddle music from 2 of the Garza boys, and dancing that went on into the evening. Helen danced with Isaac 3 times and with Pastor Davis once and with old Walt Drummond, who turned out to be a surprisingly graceful dancer for a man of 60, and she watched everything around her with a clear-eyed fullness that she recognized as joy, properly felt. They moved her things into the larger farmhouse on the Callaway place, McCrae Place. She corrected herself, her place now too, and she kept her own farm as an operational honey farm, riding over most mornings to tend the hives, continuing to bring her honey to the market on the first Saturday of every month. This was exactly as they had agreed. The life they built together was not without difficulty. Ranching in Texas in the 1880s was a business that offered no certainty and demanded constant work. And there were seasons when the cattle did not thrive as hoped, and seasons when the rain failed, and seasons when the market price for beef dropped so low that the accounting made grim reading. Helen had her own difficult seasons too. A summer infestation that cost her 4 hives, a dry spring in 1884 that reduced the wildflower yield to almost nothing, a stretch of weeks when the farm felt as hard as it had in those first solitary years. But she had Isaac and he had her, and the difference between facing hard things alone and facing them alongside someone who understood was not a small difference. It was, in fact, the difference between a life that merely endured and a life that was lived. In the autumn of 1883, a year after their wedding, their first child was born, a boy they named James, after Isaac's father. He arrived into the world with a great deal of noise and very little patience, qualities that persisted as he grew, and Helen loved him with a ferocity that surprised her, that enormous consuming love of a first child, which she had heard described but had not understood until it was her own. Isaac held his son with careful, wondering hands and looked at Helen over the baby's head with an expression that required no words, and she thought that the world had grown larger overnight in a way she had not anticipated. James was 2 years old and thoroughly in charge of every room he entered when their second child, a daughter they named Ruth after Helen's mother, arrived in the winter of 1886. She was quieter than James from her first weeks, with a watchful quality that reminded Helen of herself and a stubbornness that was entirely her father's, though Isaac refused to acknowledge this when Helen pointed it out. "She is persistent," he said firmly. "That is different from stubborn." "It is not different from stubborn," Helen said. "It will serve her well," he said, and he smiled the smile that still did what it had always done to her. The town of Millhaven grew throughout the late 1880s, as the railroad began to push into that part of Texas and brought with it commerce and newcomers, and the particular disruption of places that are changing faster than their older residents are comfortable with. Some of this was good, better markets, access to more supplies, a proper school for James and later Ruth, and some of it was the rougher edge of rapid growth, disputes over land and water rights, and the kind of men that opportunity sometimes drew before it drew anything better. Isaac navigated all of this with his characteristic steadiness, building relationships with his neighbors, registering every piece of his land carefully with the county office, staying current on the evolving laws regarding water rights, which were becoming a genuine issue as more ranchers crowded into the hill country, and the creeks became contested. He was not a man who looked for trouble, but he was equally not a man who walked away from what was right. And there was an incident in the spring of 1887 when a newly arrived rancher named Glendon made a claim on a stretch of creek that ran through the shared boundary between Isaac's land and the Hernandez family's place to the south, a claim that was dubious legally and unjust practically. And Isaac spent 3 weeks in the county courthouse with documents and witnesses until the matter was settled in favor of the Hernandez family, to the considerable gratitude of the family and the considerable irritation of Glendon, who eventually sold his place and moved on. Helen watched him do this and felt the same thing she always felt when she saw Isaac McCrae doing what he thought was right, a deep, settled pride that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with recognizing goodness when you were fortunate enough to be married to it. She had her own battles in those years. The honey business had grown steadily. Her bluebonnet variety had developed a genuine regional reputation by 1887, and she was receiving small orders by mail from as far as Austin. She had hired a young woman named Clara Torres to help with the harvest in the busy seasons, and the two of them worked together well, with a comfortable, frank camaraderie. Clara was 22 and sharp and learning fast, and Helen taught her the way her mother had taught her through doing, through watching, through the patient repetition of things done right until they became instinct. There was a woman in Millhaven named Agnes Fry who had decided at some point, without Helen's input, that it was inappropriate for a married woman to be running a business as Helen did, and Agnes made this view known on several occasions in the way that certain women made their views known, not directly to Helen, but in the parlors and churchyards where opinion was formed. Helen was aware of this and chose not to address it directly, which she recognized as a calculated decision rather than weakness. She had her husband's support, her customers' money, and her own certainty, and she had learned long ago that not every opinion required a response. Isaac, for his part, referred anyone who brought the subject up in his presence to mind their own affairs, which he did with such polite finality that the subject generally did not arise again. In the summer of 1888, they had their third child, a boy they named Daniel, who arrived 2 weeks late and then made up for the delay by being the most vigorous infant Helen had ever encountered. James, who was 5, regarded his new brother with the careful suspicion of a firstborn whose position had been renegotiated twice now, and it took several weeks of patient management before he arrived at an acceptance of Daniel that would eventually, over years, deepen into the uncomplicated loyalty of brothers. Isaac added a room to the house that summer, doing much of the carpentry himself with help from Pedro Vasquez, who had stayed on and become genuinely indispensable to the operation, and who was now 26 and saving carefully toward a land purchase of his own, which Isaac was quietly helping him plan. Helen thought about this, the way Isaac helped the people around him with the same plainly practical decency he applied to everything, and she thought that the accumulation of small right things was perhaps how the character of a life was actually written. The September of 1888 was their 6th wedding anniversary, and Isaac brought her flowers from the same fields he had brought them from on their wedding day, and they ate supper together with the 3 children at the table making a magnificent, chaotic noise, and after the children were in bed they sat on the porch in the warm September evening, and Helen leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her. 6 years, she said. 6 good years, he said. More than 6, she said, because she was counting from the October morning he had bought 11 jars of her honey and told her that was not the point, which she intended to count for as long as she lived. More than 6, he agreed. The land around them was full of night-sound crickets and distant cattle, and the thin cry of a nighthawk somewhere over the creek, and the sky above the Texas hill country was the extraordinary sky it always was, enormous and studded with stars in a density that people who lived under it tended to forget was remarkable until someone from elsewhere looked up and could not speak. Isaac, she said. He said, his chin against the top of her head. When you walked up to my table that first morning, she said, what were you going to do if I had already sold all the honey? He was quiet for a moment. I was going to introduce myself and buy whatever you had left and come back the next market. And the one after that, she said. And the one after that, he said. She smiled into his shoulder. You were very sure of yourself. No, he said. I was very sure of you. She turned her head to look at him. He was looking down at her, and in the soft dark of the porch, his face was the face she had come to know better than her own hands, and she loved it with the steady, certain love of a woman who had looked at something from every angle and found it good. That is a lovely thing to say, she said. It is the truth, he said. She kissed him, there on the porch under the Texas stars, and it was nothing like the first dramatic public kiss at the June market, and everything like 6 years of building a life together familiar and warm and entirely right. The years passed the way that good years do, not slowly but fully, each one leaving something behind that was worth keeping. By 1891, the cattle operation had grown to nearly the 200 head Isaac had predicted, and he had hired 2 more hands and built a proper barn, and was beginning to think about expanding the grazing land to the north, where a neighboring parcel had come up for sale. Helen's honey business had grown steadily, and she had begun shipping small, regular orders as far as Houston, and the little farm that Ruth Shelton had started with a handful of hives in the 1860s was now a proper operation, carefully and lovingly maintained, its reputation built jar by jar and season by season. James was 8 years old and already insisting on helping with everything, which was sometimes useful and sometimes a considerable obstacle, and Ruth was 5 and possessed of her father's persistence in full measure and her mother's practicality. a combination that suggested she would either manage something extraordinary or exhaust everyone around her in the attempt. Daniel was 3 and still in the early phase of converting the world's every object into something that could be thrown, dropped, or eaten, a phase his parents were waiting out with practiced patience. One afternoon in the spring of 1891, Helen was at her honey farm, working through a particularly productive early harvest, when Clara came to tell her there was someone at the gate. A young woman, she said, who looked like she had been traveling a long time. Helen went to the gate and found a girl of perhaps 19 standing with a small bag and a face that was tired in the particular way of someone who has been holding things together by a will for longer than was comfortable. Her name was Mattie Oates, she said, and she had come from a farm near Careville where she had been working, and the family had let her go in the autumn, and she had been trying to find work since then, and someone in Millhaven had told her that Helen McCrae might need help with the bees. Helen looked at Mattie Oates for a long moment. She thought about herself at 22, alone on a farm, being afraid but not telling anyone. She thought about her mother's patience in teaching her. "Come inside," she said. "You will have supper and you will sleep in the spare room. And tomorrow you will show me if you have a steady hand and a patient temperament, and if you do, we will discuss terms." Mattie had a steady hand and a patient temperament. She had a quick mind as well, and a genuine affinity for the work that made Helen think of herself in the best way. She stayed, and over the months that followed she became part of the operation in the same quiet, essential way that Clara had, not just labor but understanding, the kind of person you could trust with a hive in bloom and know it would be tended correctly. Helen told Isaac about Mattie that first evening, and he said, "Can she start Monday?" with such practical immediacy that Helen laughed and then said yes. The spring of 1892 brought a development that Helen had been half expecting and half dreading for years. The railroad came through Millhaven proper, not just nearby but directly through, and with it came a wave of commercial interest that reshaped the town rapidly and sometimes aggressively. The land around the station became immediately valuable, and there were men who had arrived ahead of the railroad specifically to acquire it, and some of the acquiring was done in ways that were not entirely honest or fair. The Hernandez family, whose land bordered Isaac's to the south, received a visit from a land agent named Burroughs, who was representing a cattle company out of Fort Worth, and the offer he made them was low, and the pressure he applied was not subtle. Helen heard about it from Carmen Hernandez at the market and brought it home to Isaac that evening. Isaac listened and then said, "Has Miguel talked to anyone at the land office about the current market value?" "Carmen says he does not read English well enough to manage the legal documents," Helen said. "I will go tomorrow," Isaac said. He spent the next 2 weeks helping Miguel Hernandez understand what his land was worth and what his legal position was, bringing in a lawyer from Fredericksburg at his own expense, and when Burroughs returned with his second offer, Miguel Hernandez was prepared, and the conversation went differently than Burroughs had anticipated. The Hernandez family kept their land. Burroughs moved on to easier targets, of which there were, unfortunately, enough. Helen thought about what it meant to live in this place in this time, about the ways that the promise of the frontier had always been unevenly distributed, about the Mexican families and the black families and the others who had worked this land and been more vulnerable to the pressures of men like Burroughs. She had no power to fix the structures that made those vulnerabilities real. She was a woman in 1892 Texas with no legal vote and limited public standing, but she had Isaac beside her, and they had neighbors, and neighbors who showed up for each other was its own form of resistance to the kind of world Burroughs represented. The summer of 1892 was hot and long and productive, and the honey harvest was the largest Helen had ever managed. She had 12 hives now, between her farm and the stands on Isaac's land that they had expanded into over the years, and the output was significant enough that she began thinking seriously about a small outbuilding for processing and storage that would make the work more efficient. Isaac built it for her in August, with James, now 9 and genuinely useful, helping to carry lumber. And when it was done, Helen stood in the new clean space with its good ventilation and its long work tables, and thought about her mother's kitchen where all of this had begun. "Mama," said Ruth, who was 6 and had followed her in, "will we always have bees?" "Always," Helen said. "Even when I am old," Ruth said. "Especially then," Helen said. Ruth considered this with her characteristic thoroughness. "Good," she said. "I want to learn them properly." Helen crouched down and looked at her daughter, the dark eyes that were entirely her father's, the stubborn set of her chin that was entirely her own. "Then I will teach you properly," she said. "Starting when?" Ruth said. "Starting now," Helen said. On a warm October morning in 1892, 10 years after that first Saturday at the market, Helen set up her table in the familiar spot at the center of the Millhaven market. She had 28 jars of honey, her largest single market offering, in 5 varieties, including the bluebonnet variety that was now her most requested, and a new late summer clover that was so pale it was almost white, with a sweetness that was delicate rather than dense. She arranged them in the morning light with her mother's careful attention and her own 10 years of practice, and the labels in her hand were more elegant than they had been then, worn slightly smoother by experience but still entirely hers. At 9 o'clock, Isaac McCrae arrived with 2 cups of coffee from the Garza tent, as he had 100 times over a decade, and he set her cup down on the corner of the table and stood beside her and looked at the market in the morning. 28 jars, he said. 28, she said. I will take all of them, he said. She turned to look at him. He was 40 this year, with gray beginning at his temples and the deep tan of a man who worked outside every day of his life, and he was looking at her the way he always had, the warmth and the steadiness and that quality she had learned to call home, because that was what it felt like. You absolutely do not need 28 jars of honey, she said. That is not the point, he said. She laughed, and then she was laughing so hard she had to set her coffee down, and customers were looking at them with the mild curiosity of people who have seen something genuinely happy, and Isaac stood beside her and smiled his rare, complete smile, and the October morning was warm and clean and full of light. She did not let him buy all 28. She sold 22 to various customers through the morning, which was a record, and she let him buy the remaining 6 at the end of the market with exaggerated ceremony. I should charge you extra for sentimental value, she said. Add it to my account, he said. You do not have an account, she said. You always pay cash. Then I will open one, he said, and he tucked the small crate under his arm and offered her his other hand, and she took it, and they walked through the market together toward the wagon with their children running ahead. James at 11 already nearly as tall as Helen, Ruth at 9 precise and purposeful, Daniel at 7 in a state of continuous kinetic energy, and the town of Millhaven went about its Saturday business around them. And Helen McCrae thought that the life she was inside of was almost too full to hold. That evening, with the children finally settled, and the house quiet with the particular quality of quiet that comes after a day well used, Helen sat at the kitchen table and opened one of the 6 jars Isaac had bought at the market. She spread honey on a piece of bread and held it for a moment and thought about all the mornings she had gotten up before dawn to check on her hives, all the harvests and the winters and the seasons that had gone into this jar. She thought about her mother's hands on hers, teaching her to move slowly near the bees. She thought about the woman she had been at 22, capable and afraid and absolutely determined, and the woman she was now, which was all of those things and more. Isaac came and sat across from her with his own piece of bread, and she pushed the jar toward him without speaking. He spread honey on the bread and took a bite and looked at her. It is very good, he said. It is, she said. The best one yet, he said. The blue bonnet, she asked. No, he said. The wildflower. He held up the jar and looked at the color of it in the lamplight, that deep amber warmth, the honey from 1,000 ordinary flowers. This one tastes like home. Helen looked at him across the kitchen table in the house they had built together, with the sound of their sleeping children somewhere in the rooms behind them and the Texas night pressing its dark and starlit face against the windows. And she thought that she had been right 10 years ago when she had felt something shift like a door opening in a house she thought was closed. She had been right to open it. She had been right about all of it. "Isaac," she said. "Helen," he said. "I am very glad you do not like honey," she said. He smiled, slow and complete. "I never said I did not like honey," he said. "I said that was not the point." "What is the point?" she asked, as she had asked that first morning 10 years ago. "You," he said, as simply as breathing. "You are the point. You have always been the point." She reached across the table and took his hand, the way she had taken it in the cold January afternoon among the cedar, and he held it with the same firm, unhurried certainty. And outside the Texas night was enormous and full of stars. And inside the lamp was warm and the honey was sweet, and Helen Shelton McCrae was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the man she was supposed to be beside, and everything that had led here. The solitude and the work and the loss and the carefully kept hope of it made a story that she would have chosen, had she been given the choosing, precisely as it was. In the spring of 1893, Ruth came to her mother in the early morning while the dew was still on the grass, and the bees were just beginning to stir, and Helen put the proper gloves on her daughter's small, determined hands, and let her stand at the entrance to the nearest hive and watch and listen and learn to be still. Ruth stood with a patience that was remarkable for a 9-year-old and watched the bees move in and out of their home, and she did not flinch and she did not hurry. And when Helen looked at her daughter's face, it was full of the careful, steady attention of someone who has recognized something true and is taking the time to understand it properly. "There are so many of them," Ruth said quietly. "Thousands," Helen said. "And they all know what to do," Ruth said. "They do," Helen said. "They learned it and then they did it and now they know it." Ruth considered this for a long moment, her eyes still on the hive. "I want to learn it too," she said. "I know you do," Helen said. "And you will." The morning opened around them, full of the sound of bees in the wildflowers and the warmth of a Texas spring day beginning. And somewhere behind them in the house James was making the noise that was their signal to start breakfast. And somewhere out on the land Isaac was already at work with the cattle, moving through the morning with the steady purpose that was his own nature. And all of it, the land and the work and the honey and the family built from nothing but choice and stubbornness and love, was real and whole and entirely, completely good.